The microphone was still on when my husband's hand connected with my face. I heard the feedback spike through the ballroom speakers, a sharp whine that cut through the string quartet, through the clink of champagne flutes, through 400 conversations that all stopped at once. I stood there in the middle of the Carrington Grand Hotel's main ballroom, in the dress I had picked out 6 weeks ago, in the room I had spent 4 months organizing, and I felt the heat spread from my cheekbone down into my jaw. Something settled in my chest. Not rage, not humiliation, something older and quieter, like a door closing on a long hallway. I reached into my clutch. I found my phone. I typed 4 words and pressed send. The tote bag on the chair beside the entrance held everything I needed. Then I turned back to face the room. The string quartet had resumed playing. I could hear the low note of the cello moving under the room's new noise, the kind of noise a crowd makes when it is deciding, collectively, whether what it just saw was real. I let them decide. I already had. My name is Claire Pellerin. I was 34 years old that Thursday in October, and I had been married to Daniel Pellerin for 9 years. Daniel ran Pellerin and Associates, a mid-sized commercial real estate consulting firm with offices in Dublin, Ohio. The firm had his name on the letterhead. Most people in that ballroom assumed it had always been his. They didn't know about Findlay. I grew up in a house on Becker Road in Findlay, Ohio, the kind of street where every neighbor knew your car by its sound. My father, Robert Hargrove, had spent 30 years building a property development company that most people in central Ohio had never heard of by name but had absolutely heard of by result. He didn't advertise. He didn't give interviews. He worked through subsidiary holding entities and quiet acquisitions, and by the time I was in college, his firm controlled more than 40 commercial properties across 5 counties. He was not a man who needed a room to know who he was. He had simply never required their recognition. I had left that world deliberately. I met Daniel in graduate school. He was sharp and funny, and he had a hunger I recognized, the kind that comes from having something to prove. I believed in that hunger. I wanted to build something with him rather than inherit something from my father. It felt important at the time to make that distinction. I understood even then that I was choosing the harder version of the same future, and I made that choice with both eyes open. So I did not tell Daniel the full scope of my father's holdings until after we were engaged. And even then I kept it quiet, because Daniel's pride was a living thing and I understood that it needed room to breathe. The thing about choosing the harder version of something is that you don't always recognize the moment it becomes harder than you planned. Daniel and I had built a good rhythm in those first years. We argued about small things and agreed about large ones, and I believed, in the specific way that people in their late 20s believe things before the evidence accumulates, that what we were building was equal in its foundations even when it wasn't equal in its labor. I was wrong about that. But I was not wrong about him, not at first. He was exactly who I thought he was. He just didn't grow in the directions I had accounted for. Those early years I carried things quietly. I brought organizational capacity to what he had been building by instinct alone. When he didn't know what was missing from a pitch, I found it. When the early momentum threatened to outpace the structure, I steadied it. That was the first of many accommodations I made without being asked. In the year before Pellerin and Associates landed its first major contract, I was working as a project coordinator for a commercial interiors firm during the day and handling Daniel's client proposals at night. I formatted pitch decks. I researched zoning regulations for parcels he was targeting. I sat across from him at our kitchen table in the apartment on Westerville Road and read every contract clause until I understood it well enough to summarize it in plain language, because Daniel processed information better when someone else had already filtered it. I did not think of this as labor at the time. I thought of it as partnership. Over the years that followed, my contributions shifted shape but never volume. When Daniel needed a business account, I had the credit history to anchor. I signed. When the firm's early office lease required a personal guarantor, I was the one with the financial standing to qualify. I handled the household infrastructure, the insurance renewals, the property taxes on our house in New Albany, the contractor relationships when we renovated, so that Daniel could keep his full attention on the firm during the years it was most fragile. He never acknowledged this directly. He was not an unkind man in those years, just an absent one in the specific way that ambitious people become absent. present in the room but located somewhere else entirely. There were months when I managed everything. The firm's receivables were slow, and I covered the shortfall from my own account 3 times without being asked, because asking felt like pressing on something fragile, and I had learned early that Daniel's confidence was load-bearing. When the firm's second-year lease came up for renewal on the Commerce Parkway building, I was the one who reviewed the renewal terms and flagged the clause that would have locked them into a 5-year escalation they couldn't afford. Daniel made the phone call. I had written out what to say. The house we lived in, a 4-bedroom colonial in New Albany, had been purchased at $724,500 in 2019. My name was on the deed. This was not an accident. My father had advised me quietly years earlier to ensure that any major asset we acquired together carried my name as a primary holder. I had listened. Daniel had not objected at the time because he had not paid close attention to the paperwork. That deed, by October of that year, had been sitting in a county stamp transfer folder in my tote bag for 3 weeks. The gala was my idea. The firm had reached a milestone, 10 years of operation, a client list that had grown beyond what Daniel had originally projected, a moment worth marking. I proposed the event 8 months out. I sourced the Carrington Grand because I knew their event coordinator personally, and I knew we could negotiate a package that fit within a reasonable budget. I managed the production end, catering approvals, AV specifications, seating arrangements, invitations, and the guest list, which I curated carefully to include the right mix of current clients, prospective ones, and the local commercial real estate contacts who had helped the firm in its early years. The total production budget was $18,340. I brought it in at $17,890. Daniel had one job for the evening: show up and be gracious. He brought Melissa instead. Melissa Doran had been his executive assistant for 2 years. I had noticed the shift in how he spoke about her, a certain lightness in his voice when her name came up, a particular quality of irritation when I asked routine questions about firm events that she usually coordinated. I had found the messages 6 weeks before the gala. Not by snooping. I had borrowed his laptop to print a document, and the thread was open on the screen. A long one, months of it, with the easy shorthand of 2 people who had stopped being careful. I had closed the laptop. I had gone to the kitchen. I had stood at the counter for a long time without doing anything. Then I had called my father. I arrived at the Carrington Grand at 6:15 on Thursday evening, well before the guests. I checked the table arrangements, confirmed the AV setup was running correctly, approved the past appetizer order with the banquet manager, and spoke briefly with the quartet. I was at the entrance to greet the first guests at 7. Daniel arrived at 7:40. Melissa was beside him. She was wearing a dress I recognized, a silhouette I had seen in photos on his phone, one I had registered without quite letting myself register it. She walked in as though she had been invited. She had been, apparently. Daniel had added her name to the guest list without mentioning it to me. I did not say anything then. I continued working the room. I walked a Hartfield Group executive to a conversation he needed to have with one of our architects and made sure they had common ground before I stepped away. I checked on the catering timeline with the banquet manager. I noted which tables had gone quiet and moved through them. It was at 8:47 when Melissa found me at the edge of the room near the bar. She touched my arm. "You look exhausted," she said. "This must have been a lot of work for you." "It was," I said. "Daniel said you insisted on handling everything yourself." She tilted her head slightly. "I could have helped." I said nothing for a moment. "I had it covered," I said. "Of course." She smiled. "He worries about you, you know. He says you take on too much and then you're difficult about it afterward." I set my glass on the bar. "I'd like you to step away from me," I said. Her expression shifted into something that looked like sympathy. "I'm just trying to be kind. There's no reason for you to be defensive." "I'm not being defensive. I'm asking you to step away." "Claire." Daniel's voice came from my left. He had moved close without my noticing. "Don't make a scene." "I'm not making anything," I said. I asked her to give me space. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said. I organized this entire event. I would like the woman you're having an affair with to stop speaking to me." The word landed. I watched it reach his face. "That's enough," he said very quietly. "Is it?" I said, "That's enough, Claire." Melissa took a small step back. Around us, the nearest conversations had gone still. I could feel the attention of the room gathering without turning to look at it. "You need to lower your voice," Daniel said. "I haven't raised it. You are making a scene in front of my clients." "Our clients," I said. His jaw tightened. The word had reached the wrong people and he knew it. His hand came up. I did not see it in time to move. The sound was flat and sharp. The feedback from the nearby microphone carried it. In the silence that followed, I heard someone near the bar let out a short, startled laugh. The kind that happens before a crowd decides what it's doing, and then a few others followed, the uncomfortable laughter of people who don't know what else to do with what they just saw. Daniel looked at his own hand. Something moved across his face. "You're ungrateful," he said. "Everything I've built, everything I've given you, and this is how you act." I did not answer him. The silence after that sentence was its own kind of weather. I walked to the restroom. I stood at the sink. I ran cold water over my wrist. I looked at my face in the mirror. The fluorescent light was flat and honest. A pale pink welt was forming along my left cheekbone, already visible, already climbing toward my eye. I dried my hands. I opened my clutch. I took out my phone. I opened my messages. I typed, "Dad. It's time. Carrington Grand. Now." I pressed send. I put the phone back in my clutch. I straightened my dress. I walked out of the restroom and back into the ballroom. Daniel and Melissa had moved to the center of the room. He was speaking to a group of clients. 3 men I recognized from the firm's longest-standing contracts, with the particular animation he used when he needed to perform confidence. Melissa stood close to his shoulder, not quite touching near enough. The quartet had resumed. The room had resumed. I found a position near the back, beside one of the tall cocktail tables, and I waited. 8 minutes passed. At 9:11, the main ballroom doors at the far end opened. My father walked in. He was 63 years old and he did not rush. He wore a dark suit and he walked the way he always walked, with the specific patience of someone who has never needed to announce himself because the room has always eventually come to understand what it is dealing with. Beside him were 2 men. One was Gerald Fitch, who had been my father's attorney for 20 years, and the other was Warren Chu, who ran the largest commercial property acquisition firm in Central Ohio and had been my father's business partner for 15 of those years. I watched the room process them. The executives from Hartfield Group saw Warren Chu first. I saw one of them put down his drink. The partner from Meridian Properties saw Gerald Fitch and leaned toward his colleague and said something I could not hear. Daniel saw my father and went very still. My father crossed the room and stopped in front of Daniel. He did not extend his hand. "Mr. Pellerin," he said. "Robert." Daniel's voice had changed register entirely. "I didn't know you were. Claire didn't mention." "She mentioned it tonight," my father said. The 3 clients Daniel had been entertaining had gone quiet. The nearest tables had turned. "This isn't the place," Daniel started. "You struck my daughter," my father said. "In a room of 400 people. I think the question of what place is appropriate has already been answered. It was a misunderstanding. She was escalating a private. She organized this event," my father said. "She built your client relationships. She guaranteed your first lease." He paused. "She also holds the primary title on your house." Daniel blinked. "Warren," my father said without looking away from Daniel. Warren Chu stepped forward. "The Pellerin and Associates office building at 4400 Commerce Parkway," he said, "is currently held under a lease agreement with Hargrove Property Holdings as the underlying landlord entity. That lease is up for renewal in 60 days. Daniel's face went through several things in quick succession. "You didn't know," my father said. "It was not a question. She didn't tell you because you never asked where the building came from." You assumed it was luck. Robert, You called her ungrateful, my father said. In front of her own event. In the room she built. The silence in our corner of the ballroom had spread. I could see people at tables 10 feet away who had stopped speaking entirely. I walked forward. I opened my tote bag. I reached in past my phone and my keys, and I took out the county stamp transfer folder, the corners worn soft from 3 weeks of carrying. I opened the folder. I turned it to face Daniel. The deed to the New Albany house lay flat in my hands. My name listed as primary holder, the transfer paperwork already filled in and notarized, requiring only his acknowledgement of receipt. I filed the separation paperwork this morning, I said. Gerald has a copy. Your attorney will have one by morning. Daniel looked at the document. He looked at me. Everything you gave me, I said. I want to be accurate about that. The lease you signed was on a building my father owned. The account that guaranteed your first contract was in my name. The event you just hit me at, I planned it, budgeted it, and ran it. I folded the document closed. So when you said ungrateful, I want to make sure we both understand what that word was doing. He didn't answer. You don't have to, I said. I already know. I set the folder on the cocktail table beside me. My father placed his hand briefly on my shoulder, one light touch, and then stepped back. Gerald Fitch handed Daniel a sealed envelope. I turned and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard the sound of chairs, executive chairs, client chairs, as people shifted, stood, moved. Not applause. Something quieter than that. The sound of a room deciding what it had just witnessed. That was 14 months ago. The New Albany house sold 3 months after I filed the separation papers. My portion of the equity went into an account I opened in my own name at a bank Daniel had never used. I moved back to Findlay for the first 6 months. Back to Becker Road, back to the house I had grown up in, and I worked from my father's office while I figured out the shape of what came next. I am sitting at that office now. My father's old drafting table, a heavy oak thing with a surface worn down in the center from 40 years of use, is my desk. I refinished it myself last spring, sanding it back by hand over 3 weekends, and when I set my laptop on it in the mornings I can feel the grain under my wrists. Daniel contacted me once, through his attorney, 6 weeks after the gala. The message was framed as a request for mediation regarding the house equity split. Gerald Fitch sent a reply on my behalf. I never responded directly. His attorney sent a follow-up 2 weeks later. That one Gerald also handled. The thread closed there and I let it. I have not heard from him since. The firm is doing what firms do when their structural support is removed quietly and all at once. It is contracting. Warren Chu's company did not renew the Commerce Parkway lease. 3 of the long-standing clients I had personally cultivated moved their business elsewhere within the year. I did not orchestrate this. I simply stopped being the infrastructure that held it steady, and the parts that were always his fell to the level they could sustain on their own. I am starting something new. Something in my own name, in a field I chose rather than inherited. My father has offered resources, and I have accepted some of them. The desk, the office space, the introduction to one attorney who specializes in the specific structure I am building. I have declined the rest. That distinction still matters to me even now. Some people believe that leaving is the loss. That staying, absorbing, enduring, that is what it means to be strong. I used to believe a version of that myself. What I know now is that I stood in a room of 400 people with a welt rising on my face, and I did not raise my voice once. I held a county-stamped folder and I read 3 sentences and I walked out. And the only regret I carry is not how it ended, but how long I waited to believe that the door had always been mine to open. I pick up my father's old drafting compass from the corner of the desk, the one he used to use for property survey sketches, heavy brass, cold in the hand every morning until my palm warms it, and I start the day. If this story found you when you needed it, share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet is not the same as weak. I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next one.